Okay, so you want to own a drone delivery fleet, silent aircraft gliding over rooftops, packages dropping onto doorsteps in minutes instead of hours, the future of last-mile logistics arriving right on schedule. Here's the number that should stop you before you go any further. According to Amazon's own internal projections, reported by Business Insider, delivering a single package by drone in 2025 cost the company approximately $63. Industry-wide, every major operator studying this business has run the same math and landed on the same conclusion. For drone delivery to actually generate a profit at scale, the cost per delivery needs to fall somewhere between $8 and $12. That's not a small gap to close. That's a business currently operating at 5 to 8 times its own break-even cost, propped up by some of the deepest corporate pockets on Earth. More than a decade after the technology was first promised to the public as inevitable, let's start with why that gap is so brutal, because it explains almost everything about how this industry actually behaves. The core constraint isn't the drone itself, it's the person watching the drone. Current regulations in most of the world require a level of human oversight for every aircraft in the sky that simply doesn't scale the way software does. Across operating networks today, the average drone completes somewhere between 3 and 8 deliveries a day. To hit the volume needed to make the unit economics work, an operator needs each aircraft completing 200 or more deliveries daily, a jump of roughly 25 to 60 times current throughput. The only way to get there is full autonomy, one remote operator monitoring 8 or more drones simultaneously instead of one, which changes the labor cost allocated to each individual delivery from something in the range of $5 to $8 down to 1 or 2. Until regulators allow that shift at scale, the entire industry is stuck paying a labor bill sized for a business 10 times smaller than the one it's trying to become. Here's the part: almost nobody researching this industry understands before they commit serious capital to it. And it's the reason the words drone delivery cover businesses that have almost nothing in common with each other. This isn't one business model flying under one banner. It's at least 4 fundamentally different operating strategies. And which one you're actually running determines whether that brutal unit economics gap is a temporary hurdle or a permanent wall. The first model is consumer e-commerce delivery, the Amazon and Walmart vision, dropping small retail packages, batteries, vitamins, phone chargers, directly to suburban doorsteps within a tight delivery radius, competing on speed and convenience against a ground delivery network that's already extraordinarily efficient. The second is medical and emergency logistics, delivering blood, vaccines, and critical supplies to locations where the alternative isn't a slower delivery, it's often no delivery at all, a category where the value of speed is measured in lives rather than convenience. The third is industrial and infrastructure inspection, using drones not to deliver packages, but to survey pipelines, power lines, and construction sites, a business built around data collection rather than logistics, with an entirely different revenue model. And the fourth is enterprise and B2B logistics, moving parts, documents, and time-sensitive materials between business locations under contracts that don't depend on winning over individual consumers one delivery at a time. Notice what actually separates a viable version of this business from an unviable one, and it isn't the drone hardware, which is broadly similar across all 4 categories. It's the alternative each model is actually competing against. A consumer e-commerce drone is competing against a delivery van that already runs a dense, optimized suburban route for a few dollars a stop. A medical logistics drone is competing against a dirt road that becomes impassable during rainy season, and a patient who might not survive the wait. Those are not remotely the same competitive bar to clear. And an operator that doesn't understand which bar it's actually being measured against is an operator that can build genuinely excellent technology and still lose money on every single flight. Most of the public attention and most of the capital has poured into the first model, the consumer e-commerce dream that Jeff Bezos first promised the public back in 2013. But by the end of this, you'll understand why the company that's actually proven this technology works at genuine scale built almost none of its business on that model, and why the most heavily funded consumer drone delivery program in the world, is, more than a decade later, still struggling to prove it can exist as a real business at all. Now, where does the cost side of this business actually come from? And why has closing that gap between $63 and $8 proven so much harder than early predictions assumed? Fleet acquisition itself is almost the least of it. A commercial delivery drone typically costs between $10,000 and $50,000 depending on payload capacity and range, and a starter fleet of 5 to 10 aircraft can be assembled for somewhere between $50,000 and $250,000, a genuinely modest sum compared to almost any other logistics infrastructure investment. The real capital sink sits elsewhere: a single distribution hub, the physical facility where drones launch, land, recharge, and get loaded with packages, runs $200,000 to $500,000 per location. The flight management software required to safely coordinate dozens or hundreds of aircraft simultaneously, what the industry calls a UTM system, costs anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million just to develop. And regulatory compliance, the single most expensive and least visible line item in this entire industry, can run $1 to $5 million per market. Once you account for FAA Part 135 air carrier certification, individual beyond visual line of sight waivers, and the extensive documentation and safety cases regulators require before a single autonomous flight ever crosses a residential neighborhood, put a fleet of 20 drones, one distribution hub, and full regulatory clearance together, and total capital requirements land somewhere between $1 and $3 million before the first commercial package ever leaves the ground. That capital intensity explains something structurally important about who actually survives in this industry. This is a business dominated almost entirely by extraordinarily well-funded operators, not because smaller companies lack good technology, but because the regulatory and infrastructure costs alone are large enough to eliminate anyone without access to genuinely enormous capital reserves. One operator has raised more than $900 million. Another operates inside a parent company with the full resources of one of the largest technology conglomerates on Earth behind it. A third has access to what amounts to unlimited capital from one of the largest logistics operations in the world. This is not an industry where a well-run small business can simply out-execute its way to profitability. It's an industry where the entry price alone filters out everyone except a handful of organizations wealthy enough to lose money for a decade while waiting for regulation and unit economics to eventually align. Here's the trap that has quietly humbled some of the most resourced companies on the planet, and it isn't the drones failing technically. It's the collision between an ambitious public timeline and a regulatory environment that refuses to move at the pace commercial pressure demands. Since August of 2025, the FAA has allowed beyond visual line of sight approvals under updated rules. But before that, every single new delivery location required its own individual waiver, negotiated market by market, city by city. A proposed rule that would standardize this process, known as Part 108, has been discussed for years and still isn't expected in final form until sometime in 2026, meaning an operator trying to expand into a new city today still has to run the exact same expensive, slow regulatory gauntlet the industry has been navigating since the technology was first tested. Physical constraints compound the regulatory ones in ways that quietly shrink the addressable market further than most projections initially assumed. Most current commercial delivery drones can carry a maximum payload of around 5 pounds, which immediately excludes a huge share of what a typical household actually orders online. Extreme heat above roughly 104 degrees Fahrenheit grounds much of the operating fleet entirely, and heavy rain, high wind, and low visibility all impose additional restrictions most ground vehicles simply shrug off without a second thought. A delivery van doesn't care if it's 90 degrees outside or drizzling lightly. A fleet of small aircraft absolutely does, and every hour of restricted flying weather is an hour where the fixed costs of hubs, software licenses, and regulatory compliance keep accruing, while the revenue-generating side of the business sits grounded. There's no better, more public illustration of exactly how that collision plays out than what happened and is still happening to Amazon's Prime Air program. Jeff Bezos announced Amazon's ambition to deliver packages by drone within 30 minutes back in 2013. promising a future where delivery drones would become as common a sight as mail trucks. It took until 2020 for the company to actually receive FAA approval to begin any commercial drone delivery at all. Real deliveries didn't begin until late 2022, nearly a full decade after the original announcement, launching in 2 test markets, Lockford, California, and College Station, Texas. What followed was less a triumphant launch and more a slow-motion demonstration of exactly how hard the unit economics and regulatory gap actually is to close, even for a company with Amazon's resources. In January of 2023, Amazon cut more than 18,000 jobs company-wide, and Prime Air was hit hard in the layoffs, with sites in Lockford, College Station, and a third location in Pendleton, Oregon, all losing staff. Former employees told CNBC that the Lockford site was reduced to a single certified commercial pilot, so thin on staffing that Amazon had to fly an employee in from College Station just to keep basic operations running. A facility that, even at that point, could only actually deliver to 2 houses located next door to each other, less than a mile from the launch site. By April of 2024, Amazon shut down the Lockford program entirely, less than 2 years after it had opened, citing strategic business reasons. In December of 2024, 2 Prime Air drones collided mid-air in Oregon, prompting Amazon to suspend flights in both College Station and Arizona, while it pushed a software update across the fleet. And by 2025, Amazon had ended drone operations in College Station entirely, its original flagship test market, shifting its strategy once again toward newer locations and a redesigned aircraft. Throughout all of it, the persistent complaints from residents in these test markets, described repeatedly to journalists as sounding like a giant hive of bees, disrupting sleep for night shift workers, and unsettling quiet suburban neighborhoods, sat alongside the deeper structural problem no amount of community relations work could fix. Amazon's own internal cost projections put the price of a single drone-delivered package at roughly $63 in 2025, a number that, according to the company's own stated viability threshold, needs to fall by roughly 80 to 85% before this becomes a business rather than an extraordinarily expensive demonstration of what's technically possible. Here's a structural lesson buried inside more than a decade of Prime Air's history. Amazon wasn't defeated by bad engineering. The drones themselves work. Packages that are supposed to arrive in 30 minutes generally do arrive in 30 minutes when the flight actually happens. What Amazon ran into was a business model built around chasing the hardest possible version of this technology first, general consumer e-commerce delivery, competing directly against one of the most efficient ground delivery networks ever built in dense residential neighborhoods where every noise complaint, every safety incident, and every individual city's regulatory posture becomes a fresh obstacle that has to be renegotiated from scratch. The company, with arguably more logistics capital and expertise than any other organization on the planet, has spent more than a decade and, by any reasonable estimate, hundreds of millions of dollars, and still cannot point to a single market where drone delivery operates at anything resembling the cost structure of the trucks it's trying to replace. Now, compare that to an operator that built its entire strategy around the exact opposite instinct, choosing the segment of this industry where drone delivery wasn't competing against an efficient alternative, because for a huge share of its customers, there simply wasn't one. Zipline was founded in 2016, launching first in Rwanda, delivering blood, vaccines, and emergency medical supplies to hospitals and clinics that, in many cases, had no reliable ground transportation alternative at all, especially during the country's rainy season, when roads to rural health facilities could become genuinely impassable. Rather than competing on cost against an established, efficient delivery network, Zipline was competing against the alternative of a patient dying while waiting hours, sometimes days, for a blood transfusion or emergency medication that a drone could deliver in under 45 minutes. That single strategic choice changed everything about the underlying economics. In Rwanda, Zipline drones now deliver more than 65% of the country's blood supply outside the capital city of Kigali. Research studies tied to the program have documented a 51% reduction in maternal mortality from postpartum hemorrhage, a roughly 67% reduction in blood product wastage since hospitals no longer needed to stockpile supplies against unpredictable resupply timelines, and immunization coverage increases of up to 37 percentage points in the regions the network serves. The company expanded into Ghana in 2019, building 4 distribution centers that now serve more than 2,000 health facilities and roughly 12 million people, and by early 2025, Zipline's global network had completed more than 1.4 million deliveries and logged over 100 million autonomous flight miles across multiple countries, expanding further into Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, and pilot programs across the United States. The mechanism behind that success wasn't cheaper drones or friendlier regulators. It was choosing a market where the value delivered per flight was measured against a genuinely terrible alternative rather than against an efficient one. A delivery that saves a mother's life during a postpartum hemorrhage doesn't need to compete on a per-package cost basis against a delivery truck that already runs efficient, high-density suburban routes for a few dollars a stop. It needs to beat the alternative of no timely delivery existing at all. And against that bar, even an economically imperfect drone delivery system represents an enormous, measurable improvement. Zipline's own government partners have been candid that routine drone deliveries can sometimes cost more per unit than routine ground deliveries, where roads and infrastructure already exist. The company's argument, borne out by the results, is that the economics look completely different once you account for reduced waste, faster emergency response, and outcomes that are extraordinarily difficult and expensive to achieve any other way. In November of 2025, Zipline announced an expansion partnership with the U.S. State Department worth up to $150 million in American funding, backed by up to $400 million in African government utilization fees, scaling its network from thousands to tens of thousands of health facilities across 5 countries. The difference between these two outcomes wasn't the quality of the aircraft, and it wasn't access to capital, since both Amazon and Zipline have operated with essentially no meaningful funding constraint. The difference was which alternative each company was actually competing against. Amazon chose to compete against one of the most efficient consumer logistics networks ever built, in a category where consumers already had fast, cheap, reliable delivery options, meaning drone delivery had to be not just viable but genuinely superior on cost and convenience to displace an entrenched, efficient incumbent. Zipline chose to compete against delay, spoilage, and, in the most serious cases, death, a bar so much lower that even an operationally imperfect, not yet fully cost-optimized drone network could deliver transformative value from its very first year of operation. So, how does the math actually diverge between these two approaches when you run it side by side? The disciplined scenario: you build a drone delivery business around a use case where the alternative to your service is genuinely bad: medical logistics in underserved regions, emergency supply chains, time-critical industrial parts delivery, categories where speed creates value measured in outcomes rather than mere convenience. Your cost per delivery doesn't need to beat an efficient ground network, because no efficient ground network exists in your market to begin with. Government and institutional partners are willing to fund your expansion specifically because the alternative to your service is measurably worse, not just slower. That funding model lets you scale methodically, market by market, building the operational track record and regulatory trust that eventually opens the door to genuinely difficult new markets. The way Zipline's decade of results in Africa became the evidence base supporting its expansion into the United States. Now, the concentrated scenario: you build a drone delivery business around consumer e-commerce, the largest addressable market on paper, and compete directly against a ground delivery network that decades of logistics investment have already optimized to a remarkably efficient, remarkably cheap baseline. Every dollar of cost you haven't eliminated yet is a dollar a competing delivery truck already doesn't need to spend. Every regulatory approval you need is one more city, one more waiver, one more community relations effort to convince skeptical residents that a buzzing aircraft over their backyard is worth the convenience of a faster delivery they were already getting reasonably quickly by truck. Run that same well-funded, technically sound drone program through a decade of real-world deployment, and you can end up exactly where Amazon has, having proven the technology works while still being unable to prove it works economically. A fascinating and expensive demonstration, rather than a genuine business. So, is owning a drone delivery fleet actually worth it? The advantages are genuine in the right context, where the alternative to a delivery is measured in lives, hours of critical delay, or genuinely inaccessible infrastructure. Drone delivery can create value so large that near-term unit economics become almost secondary to the outcomes it produces, and government and institutional capital will often step in specifically because that value is so clearly demonstrated. The technology itself, autonomous flight, precision landing, beyond visual line-of-sight navigation, genuinely works, and it's only getting more capable and more efficient with each new aircraft generation. But the risks are equally real, and they concentrate almost entirely in one category: consumer e-commerce delivery in markets that already have efficient, cheap ground alternatives. A drone delivery business built around competing directly against an already efficient logistics network is a business betting that regulatory change, autonomy improvements, and cost reductions will all arrive fast enough to close a gap that, as of today, still requires per delivery costs to fall by roughly 80% from where the best funded operator on Earth currently sits. That's not a bet on better engineering. It's a bet on regulatory timelines the industry itself doesn't control, and on consumer behavior shifting toward a service that, for the moment, remains meaningfully more expensive than the alternative it's trying to replace. The businesses that build something lasting in this industry are almost never the ones chasing the largest, most visible consumer market first. They're the ones that found a use case where the value of speed was measured against genuine scarcity rather than against an already efficient competitor, built their economics around that comparison rather than a much harder one, and let the operational track record from serving that market become the foundation for eventually tackling the much larger, much more difficult consumer opportunity. Everyone else tried to win first. The drone was never actually the hard part of this business. The hard part was finding the one delivery worth more than the cost of making it before trying to prove that every delivery could be. That distinction is easy to state and remarkably hard to act on, especially for an organization with the capital to keep funding an expensive bet long after the underlying math has made its verdict clear. Amazon has the resources to keep Prime Air alive for another decade if it chooses to, testing new aircraft, negotiating new city approvals, absorbing another round of layoffs and restructurings along the way. Zipline had a fraction of that capital in its earliest years and still built a genuinely profitable, life-saving logistics network by refusing to compete on the hardest possible terms first. The lesson sitting underneath both stories isn't that one company is smarter than the other. It's that the size of your bank account can buy you the ability to keep losing money on the wrong bet for a very long time, but it has never once, in the history of this industry or any other, been able to buy you the right one.